Good morning. My name is Deepak Sharma. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm one of the trainers at UC Berkeley People and Cultures, a People and Organization Development team. I serve on the NOW Conference Planning Committee, and I am your moderator for this session. I have the pleasure of welcoming everyone to the session called Feedback as a Dialogue, Leveraging Feedback to Unlock Success, which is presented by Amanda Bent of UC Berkeley Student Affairs and Dr. Rebecca Anderson from UC Berkeley School of Information. You can access all the materials for this session and all the sessions from the NOW conference website within the description of each session. Also, please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on our NOW conference website and YouTube channel for broader viewing access after the conference has concluded. This webinar marks the second day of NOW Week, 5 days of personal and career development planning for those at all stages in their careers. For those attending the Coaching HQ activities, we look forward to getting to work with you during the one-on-one and group coaching sessions held throughout the week. Please note that registration for webinars, group coaching sessions are full, and one-on-one coaching sessions are closed. You received invitations to your UC email account via nowcoachinghq@berkeley.edu email address. We know many of you will be joining us at 10 a.m. this morning for this group coaching session that corresponds with today's webinar. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce to you our two presenters. First, we have Amanda Bent, who is an educator committed to the personal and professional development of adult learners. As an English ESL instructor and student affairs professional, she has fostered student growth through holistic learning activities that promoted inclusion and belonging. In serving students across the Bay Area, she is engaged in more nuanced approaches to addressing the complex needs of adult learners. Currently, she facilitates student employment and leadership development for Berkeley IT community and student life and development specialists. Outside of work, Amanda enjoys experimenting in the kitchen, practicing yoga, and exploring the world through food, travel, music, and dance. Secondly, our next presenter is Rebecca Anderson, who is a career development leader dedicated to furthering equity and inclusion in the career landscape. As a career changer herself, from engineer to career coach, Rebecca is a popular workshop facilitator who leverages design thinking in career change and development for leaders. Rebecca is currently the Senior Director of Career Development at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Information. Rebecca recently completed her doctorate in education from UC Davis, focusing her research on gender equity in STEM careers. In her spare time, Rebecca chases after two kids, is a soccer mom, a Girl Scout volunteer, and serves as a PTA VP of Legislation. Let's give them a warm welcome to Amanda and Rebecca.
All right. Thank you, Deepak, for that introduction. Rebecca and I are very excited to speak with you all today about this topic, feedback, which we know is something that comes up frequently for all of us.
And so to kind of try to unlock the success for others, we really wanted to share some things and dive into different areas and help people reframe a bit. So with that, what we're going to go over is to start some of the common feedback narratives that we use, some of the things you might be thinking about when you hear the word feedback. Then we'll look at the role of power dynamics before we really get into the basics of giving feedback, receiving feedback, and soliciting feedback. How do you get that feedback to help you grow? And then we're going to really end by reclaiming feedback because our goal is to help you realize is that you can make the choice of what you want to do with feedback and you can reclaim it, reframe it so it works for you and so that you can map your success. So I'm excited to get started. I'm going to pass it over to Amanda to really start that feedback narrative section.
But we want you all to stop and take a moment to think about what comes up when you hear the word feedback. We're sure that it's a range of multiple different emotions, thoughts. Here are a few that stood out to us. For some of us, it may be associated with some maybe strong emotions like fear. What are they going to say about me? What is this about? Some nervousness, maybe even dread associated with feedback. For others of us, or maybe in other contexts and circumstances, we may be thinking about maybe I'm going to receive some praise for the work that I've done, maybe some gratitude for maybe an impact that I made on someone's life. Or maybe I'm thinking of feedback as growth, oh, this is great. I'm excited to learn more about how to improve my skills, how to be a better person. And so ultimately, this really, gets at the nuances, right, of feedback, that there's an array of different feelings, emotions, experiences that come up when we think about feedback. And it ultimately leads to a common narrative, actually, that we have around feedback. And so these are some of the things that Rebecca and I found is what often comes up when we think about feedback. We often think about feedback as related to our performance. How well are we doing at our jobs? How efficient are we? Are we being, productive and timely? We also tend to think about it as, criticism. We're almost expecting and anticipating sometimes the worst thing to be said to us, especially if somebody says to you, hey, can I offer you some feedback? Right? And it's typically couched as, constructive criticism, and so, as part of that too, feedback can also be a way of trying to get us to conform actually to a set of prescribed professionalism standards. This was a huge topic that came up in our discussions about feedback and thinking about who determines, what is professional. And oftentimes, as Rebecca and I were sharing examples, we thought, wow, this is actually something that comes up a lot and is perhaps at the cornerstone of feedback. So typically we think that the intentions are good. It's usually, coming from a sign of care and maybe investment in you because we all come from different backgrounds, different viewpoints, and worldviews. The way that we interpret feedback and the way that we're delivering feedback is really shaped by our identities, our communities, societies, our structures. We want to get into this conversation around the role of power dynamics and how that plays a strong role in how we're giving and receiving feedback. So, Rebecca and I are not necessarily experts in this topic. We thought that it was important to name because this is a common element. And so we found this lens of systemic oppression offered through the National Equity Project to be a useful lens to help us start to think about and frame what really goes on in those feedback conversations that come up. So, one of the things that came up was this question around who has the power here? And what is that power based on? Who gets to decide and define what is right or what is professional? And so we see that that can be defined at various different levels, right? From the individual level, again, that is shaped and kind of rooted in some of those institutional and structural layers of our society, right? When we're talking about oppression and we're talking about, feedback, we're privileging a certain worldview, right? And in turn, we're then minoritizing or diminishing other worldviews that don't map on to that specific worldview. I'll pass it to Rebecca to share an example.
Yeah, this was definitely a hot topic for us. And I think that key piece of like who gets to define what is professional is a good example. You can look at like professional dress and what does like even like a dress code or what does professional dress mean? What is that defined as? And you can think about who gets to decide what that is. And also who gets to know what that is. Who gets to understand just inherently how you're supposed to show up in different spaces, how you're supposed to dress in different spaces. For both Amanda and I, we work with students, and a lot of time, students might not know, like, depending on where they're coming from, what their background is, what is typical in a certain space, and how they might be judged in a certain space. And then we have to ask, like, why are they judged in that space? I come from a really small town, a rural town. And so I know for myself, when I came to California, I did not understand what was professional dress and what I was supposed to do in these different spaces. And it definitely caused me a lot of anxiety. I think what we're trying to convey here is that it's really good to go back to the key questions of who gets to define what is right and who gets to know. And so if you're giving feedback and you're thinking before you give feedback, thinking about these lenses and just taking a moment to consider why, why is this important? Is it really important? Who knows that it's important? It's not that we're saying you can't have a certain professional dress standard or things like that, but it's really important to think about where that's coming from and why it is there and is it necessary? Because sometimes it's not, and it's just privileging, again, a certain worldview or a certain cultural comfort, perhaps. And if you're privileging a certain comfortability of a population, then you might be making others uncomfortable, and that is what leads to systemic oppression. I think, Amanda, does that kind of make sense? So when we get into giving feedback, it really does start with mindset. And what is your mindset? What is your purpose for giving the feedback and considering those lenses? We think it's really important to look at feedback as empowerment, not trying to fix or conform, but really empower somebody else and connect feedback to their aspirations, their career aspirations, their ability to make an impact, their ability to learn, to grow in a space. And also, not just the receiver needs to learn and grow, but you as the feedback giver, really important to enter into this seeking to learn because you don't know all of what's going on. Feedback really involves multiple perspectives. It involves two people, a giver and a receiver, sometimes multiple people even, I should say, but these two different roles. And so if you're a feedback giver, you have one perspective, but you do not have the whole perspective. So you have to think about what role you have in supporting the individual in making a change in learning and how you want to learn so that you can broaden your view. In a lot of ways, you're supporting each other. It's not one direction, it's all the directions. It goes back to our original thing of feedback as a dialogue. And another tool I really like in this space is the ladder of inference. Been using this for more than 10 years. And I'm going to give you an example and kind of walk you through the ladder, and that will help you contextualize what this ladder is. So you can think of this ladder as something that comes right out of your mind. And we'll think about the example of email communication. So let's say you have a member of your team that responds really casually to email. They often reply via their phone. They even include that little sent from my phone message. They don't use salutations like hi or hello, and they don't have any signature line. They're just sending off the email. This is frustrating some other staff members who feel that this person is not taking enough time and care in their email. They think it's impersonal and informal. So at this point, it would be really easy to climb this ladder and to make up some assumptions about the staff member based on their email etiquette. You have these observable data and experiences that I just mentioned of how they're doing their email. And as you climb, you can kind of select from that data what you observe. Gosh, this person doesn't really care. They're rushing off responses. They're not taking enough time. They're just getting it out there. They're not caring about what the person's thinking when they see it. You're making these assumptions. You're making these judgments about the person. You're drawing conclusions about them. And then you adopt this belief that this person is informal, isn't professional in their email communication. And before you know it, you've built this whole story, climbed this ladder, and then are ready to give feedback and take that action. But instead, if we go back to the observable data and experiences and just think about what you see, the person responds with short messages via their phone, and the responses are sent soon after the original messages are sent. That is all you know. You don't know any of the other things about if the person's informal, if they're not taking time, if they don't care. Those are all assumptions based on data that you're selecting and cultural or personal meanings that you're adding. But if we look back to those lenses of systemic oppression, could there be different cultural values in how we communicate via email? Maybe their established email communication is a little bit different. Maybe the norms of your department aren't made clear. Who knows? Is access to that information a privilege that not everyone has? So you can look at that framework, and that really helps to see how oppression might be perpetuated here. And you can kind of go back to the fact that all you know is that observable data and experiences, and you want to ground yourself in that. And the idea that you want to learn the other person's perspective and that you have value for what they bring and start a conversation there. Because we do want everyone to feel comfortable and be able to engage, but you don't want to just add these meanings when you don't really know the intent. So I think what that gets into is this idea that feedback can be this collaborative conversation where you consider the different perspectives to the situation and you help foster this feedback dialogue. The focus is on observable data, not on people. You're not making assumptions about intent. Instead, focus on problem solving, on learning, asking questions. Withhold judgment, withhold climbing the ladder, because the feedback receivers can sense if you're coming from that place of judgment. If you climb the ladder and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go test my theory, they're going to know that. Instead, just keep yourself down into that observable data and experiences place, ground yourself in respect for that person, and seek to really understand and learn. Now we have a little bit of a framework that you can use in giving feedback that follows a lot of the things we're just saying. So the first thing is really to determine the observable data. So look at, what do you know? How do you know this to be true? Also ask yourself, how might I be wrong? What do you not know? You're not going to know the answers to all those questions, but it's important to kind of ask there. Again, just ground yourself in what you know, and seek to learn the perspective that you don't have. Then you want to really unpack your perspective on this. What is your experience? How did it affect you? Sometimes there's emotions that come up around what happened. You don't want to ignore that. You want to kind of unpack that so you can understand it. How do the lenses of systemic oppression come into place? Are the expectations clear? Are you making any judgments? How could bias play a role here? Unconscious bias. Maybe you're not trying to, but there could be something that's there. What power dynamics exist? Power dynamics are in play. It could be because of role, could be because of identity, could be because of age. There's many different ways that power dynamics could be there. And you want to acknowledge that and understand that so you can go into a conversation around feedback, understanding where it's coming from, and also trying to make things comfortable for this dialogue so that power dynamics don't hinder the conversation. Then you want to really understand the goals. What are you trying to achieve with this feedback conversation? How, again, does this feedback empower or support someone's work? And what could you learn? What are you seeking to improve? You want to understand your goals in part so you can make sure that it's worth having this feedback conversation. Is what you're trying to address a preference, or is it a need? Is it something that really is important to ensure this person can grow, to empower them, to make sure they can have an impact? Have a conversation around that and really understand where it's coming from so you can support someone else. And also, again, learn and feedback into what you're doing so that you can really have this bi-directional conversation. And then finally, we're going to start fostering this dialogue. You want to create an environment of safety. Think about, how does the other person like to receive positive or constructive feedback? What would their preferences be? Think about, are they someone who likes to go in prepared? So maybe you don't want to spring it on them in a meeting. Can I give you some feedback? They want to know it's kind of coming. Are they somebody who would like to talk in the moment or have context before they respond? Also think about how you can manage your emotions in the situation, because there may be emotions that are present. You don't want to ignore them. We want to think about how we can address them. And of course, practice active listening during the conversation. Really grounding yourself again in problem solving and seeking to understand and demonstrating to the other person that you're seeking to understand. Maybe even saying that out loud and verbalizing it. And then finally, of course, practicing empathy throughout. So making space for the other person's feelings, reactions, their emotional response. Keep in mind, you do not know all the things that person is carrying or how feedback may trigger them. So you want to really be mindful. You just don't know how they might respond. Maybe it feels like an outsized reaction to you, but it could be based in something in the past where they've gotten similar feedback. Maybe they've gotten feedback from somebody who didn't take the time to do all these steps. You just don't know what they're kind of bringing in. So it's important to think about that. Amanda, as I was talking, what kind of things came up for you? Do you have anything to add in this framework that we kind of built?
Each of these things I think are so valuable, and it can be so easy, because sometimes we can get triggered, right? And that might elicit a need to, want to give feedback, like thinking about that email example, right? I know a lot of folks that can get really annoyed with just, email etiquette. And again, what is email etiquette and who's defining that? Um, but something that came up for me with this is, we're talking about this as a dialogue. And I think that one of the things that we could add to this too is um, think about how you're asking folks, maybe how they'd like to receive feedback. I know that that's something I've been on a few different hiring committees before. And in one of the final rounds, that'll be a question that will come up is, help us understand, how do you like to receive feedback? And so I found that that question, just even asking that question, opens the door up, and again, facilitates it, as this can be a dialogue, this can be a way to help me understand a little bit more about you.
I think that's a great idea, and it's something we so often do not do, because we just kind of skip that step. But having a conversation in advance can then help make it so much easier when you do have feedback, either way to give. And again, in the spirit of making feedback a dialogue and bi-directional, asking, how do you like to receive feedback? And how do you want to give feedback to me? So that, they can feel comfortable giving feedback. If you're a manager, giving feedback up. If you're a peer, giving feedback sideways. Giving feedback can be difficult because oftentimes we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. We're worried about all those emotional things that Amanda showed in the very beginning. But if we have the conversation in advance, and if we really ground it in the idea of there's different perspectives, and oftentimes there's not really a right way to do something, but there's more a like, sometimes there's a worldview that's centered, a cultural practice that is here. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for us if we don't do that? Having those conversations, it's messy, but it's really good to have, because it's going to make it so much easier when you do have to give feedback. Um, and you'll learn something about each other and these different perspectives as well. Keep in mind, you can always table things and say, like, let's come back to this. Let's learn a little bit more. Let's reflect. Let's give space. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. You can give space at any point in time, because you can go in with the best intentions. You can kind of make some notes on all these areas, and it can still get messy. So it's always a good idea to give some space and come back to it, or offer space. And you'll never go wrong if you just keep in mind of the practicing empathy and just be really empathetic, and that you have one perspective, but not all the perspective. One other hot tip is to avoid feedback labels. So you may have noticed, Amanda and I actually brought up some of these labels. Professional. That's definitely a label. Too informal. I want to give you some feedback about the fact that you are a little too informal. You're coming across too informal to your clients. What does that mean? Who gets to decide what informal is? That is a label. It is not actionable. Somebody can't fix being too informal. They may not think they are too informal. And I use this one actually because I am pretty informal. Someone could say, I am too informal. I don't have a Zoom background right now. I am in my home office. I have a baby Yoda on top of my head. Now you're all going to stare at that. That could be considered too informal, but that is a judgment. That is a label. That isn't actionable. Now, instead of somebody said to me, for example, your background is very distracting, and so I can't pay attention to what you're saying. That's actionable. That's something we could talk about. That's something we could kind of unpack. But these labels, unprofessional to informal, to brisk, those are all things that kind of mask what's really going on underneath and inside this like box that you're packaging up. Amanda, what do you think?
Yeah, I love the concept of, the labels, because I think it's so true. The to being too informal, the, professionalism, those are the things that, like, you know, what does that really mean? So how
Mm,
do we work towards, giving feedback that is actionable, that is, speaking to how does whatever that individual is doing, how does it actually impact, you, right? And so focusing on that aspect, like with that example that you just shared, Rebecca, which FYI, I love your background. Um, but right, like getting at the actionable part, I think is key. And I'm glad you noted that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that reminds me, a lot of times when we're doing the labels, what we're really doing is we're making assumptions. We're climbing that ladder of inference, we're using a certain lens, and we are privileging one perspective. And we might be creating a whole story about somebody's intent. But instead, if we just go into like what's observable, what is the impact on me, then we can kind of have a conversation. And you might even change your mind in that conversation, or you'll at least understand where the other person is coming from, and they will understand where you're coming from and the impact, and you can move forward in a really positive way.
Yeah. I'll just add too, I think it's really lead with curiosity, right? That to me is the way we can debunk leading with stereotypes or presumptions, moving away from that and focusing on how do I be more curious? How do I lead with that curiosity, that empathy, to demonstrate that you see and respect that person as an individual, and seeing them first as an individual.
Yeah, I have that. Get curious, not furious. That is my mantra. And it is a really good one. When you go into this conversation, again, just want to kind of like remind folks to ensure everyone is open to the conversation. You want to know how people like to receive feedback, if they're open to feedback in that moment. You don't know what they're carrying, you don't know what their day is like. And so, setting the right tone at the beginning will help you have a good conversation. You want to agree on the goals, and really unpack those goals. Make them clear. Make it transparent for folks. Again, focus on that observable data, seeking to learn, getting curious, always supporting growth and development, not just preferences, making it easier for you, but really supporting somebody else. And action-oriented feedback, agree on next steps. This is even true for positive feedback. What is the next steps to build on this positive feedback? How is giving the positive feedback really support growth and development? What can they do with it? We don't want labels of positive either. Great job. That's super nice to hear, but making it action oriented helps people then take the next steps. Make space for emotions and empathy, and just really ensure that people feel seen and feel heard. That's one of the most important things. Okay, so I've given a lot on giving feedback. Now I think I'm going to turn over to Amanda to talk about receiving feedback.
Thanks, Rebecca. And how I just love this image of the present.
Feedback is a gift.
Yep. We add that to our takeaways. Feedback as a gift. Whether it's a wanted gift or an unwanted gift, we know that we all
Sometimes I want to return it.
yep. Where's the gift receipt? I don't want this. This was not on the registry. So what I love about this is that there's so much commonalities actually between our framework for giving feedback and how we can also think about receiving feedback, right? As Rebecca said, sometimes it may be something really good, maybe something you've been yearning to hear. Other times it may be something you don't want that feedback. And then other times it may just be feedback that really raises a lot of questions, right? And so when we think about receiving feedback, there's going to be a couple of key elements to keep in mind. Thinking about what are the personal triggers that come up for you, right? Again, even just if the conversation starts with, can I give you some feedback, right? Paying attention to what happens in that moment, right? And something we really want to drive through in the next, this next segment is keeping in mind that you don't have to take that feedback, right? So we're going to walk through a framework of how you can start to think about what to do with that feedback, right? So we've adapted this framework of constructivist listening that we also got from National Equity Project in thinking about these ways that you can start to use a strategy for engaging in conversations that might be, intellectually demanding and emotionally challenging, right? And that's often what feedback can lead to. So step one is really to reflect. And so we want you to, again, just as I said, really pause and ask yourself, what feelings are coming up in my body? And then you need to really ask yourself some real questions, right? Who is offering that feedback, right? Is it happening perhaps in that achieved conversation space, maybe with your manager, right? What's that relationship like with your manager? Recognize the power dynamics at play, not just in your titles, but also in your identities as well, right? Asking yourself, do I know what their intention is, right? Perhaps it's even with a colleague. Maybe it's someone who you consider to be a friend. And it could be something that you didn't anticipate them saying to you. So really figuring out, what's behind it, right? What's really the purpose of their feedback, and that goal. You may not know it in that moment, right? Are they commenting on my looks, how I'm dressed, right? How I maybe wear my hair. I know that that's something, especially a lot of Black women can relate to, is about our hair, right? In fact, my mom has told me, "Why do you wear something on your head? That's not professional." I'm like, because I don't want to hear comments. I don't want to hear comments about my hair. So this is a protective form for me, and I choose to not act on that feedback. Right. And so, what are the power dynamics? What is that person's positionality to you? If they're, that manager or your colleague, or perhaps even somebody that you supervise as well, right? What's influencing where that feedback is coming from? So a lot of questions can come up with feedback. And as with a lot of questions, there can also be a flood of different emotions that come up. And so we really encourage you to, make space to release those emotions, right? As the balloons show in the image, just let it go. We got to let it go. Name those emotions that come up. Don't ignore them. There's a reason they're coming up, and they're likely, indicating that there's, maybe some past experience we had with this. It can be triggering, as we've been mentioning. So we want to make space for that, and hold space for you to name those emotions and release them. So it's okay to say that, hey, I need to step away from this. Can we pick this up at a later time after I've had some time to think about what you shared with me? So make sure that you can ask for that and you can claim that. I need to step away. Seek to really understand those emotions, and be aware of what's going on internally. There's often that fight or flight response that came up a lot also in just our research of trying to, understand what really happens to us when we particularly get critical feedback. And the fight or flight mode was a common thing that can come up. And so it's just important to really calm your mind, your body, to kind of ground yourself back in your own self. Take deep breaths. That's always key, because again, it can be difficult. And so once you've had that time and space to, release the emotions, you've done a little bit more of reflecting, we'll move on to that next step, which is around, how do you now construct new meaning? And so this is where the work comes into play, right? Which is really thinking about, what do you want to do next, right? So this is a space where maybe after you've stepped away and you come back to the person, you can say, hey, I have some questions that I just want to ask to get some clarification about. What is this feedback? Where is it coming from? so that I can better understand what's really going on and how to interpret it, right? So then in that space, you're, ideally getting some answers, you're finding out more information, and you can start to then determine, okay, so how does this connect to my goals, right? We all have our own personal and professional goals, right? And we started this conversation off with, feedback should be a tool to support our growth and to support our learning and help us reach our goals. So, taking control of how you're interpreting the feedback is really pivotal in this moment of the constructing new meaning. Um, and then it's going to be really important to really refrain from that self judgment. We know that that can come up. We know. Um, Rebecca and I talked a lot about this. And so we want to encourage you to show yourself some compassion, practice that self compassion, and not necessarily get stuck in the judgment area.
Mhm.
So getting to the next phase, which is where you get to decide, how am I going to respond to this and act on it or not? Okay. An emphasis on the or not. So, again, claiming space to process, as Rebecca was also just mentioning, check in with trusted others, right? We all have folks that we count on, folks that we go to, right? To give us trusted advice, thoughts, ideas, people who know us. Check in with those folks and say, hey, someone just told me this. What are your thoughts on this? Are you seeing this about me too? um,
Mhm.
and really check in with them. You can use that space, that confidence circle of people who know you and you trust, so that you can determine what piece of that feedback you want to keep, and what piece you don't want to keep, right? So again, really determine how this aligns with your goals and if it really does align with your goals for growth. And then following up. I think following up is key. It doesn't need to just be one conversation, and it shouldn't just be one conversation. It should be an ongoing discussion, because again, that's how you're going to take back control on it. That's how you're going to take control of connecting it to your goals for growth, especially in the work context. And so making a plan is then going to be key, to think about how do you maybe want to incorporate the pieces that you want to follow up with, um, and deciding how to move forward. Um, and then, or it's you're receiving it and you thank the person for being willing to share, because the whole interaction of feedback, it's an act of vulnerability, right? For the person giving it, for you receiving it. So again, you can just decide, I'm just going to receive this, um thank you, and leaving it at that.
I love the leave it at that because one thing you can do when you're in this feedback conversation and you're receiving feedback, you can also give feedback to the other person, especially if they're giving you some feedback that you feel like is identity based and is maybe privileging a worldview that doesn't need to be. I'll give you an example. Women often give feedback about up talking, or my favorite, saying sorry too often. I actually hate this because I like saying sorry and I am fine with that. And if somebody thinks I am too apologetic, maybe they need to unpack that. Because I'm okay with it and I don't want to change it. The judgments that come along with that, make them. I don't think you should. I think it's privileging a certain perspective. That is my opinion. And I can decide if I'm getting that feedback to leave it, thank you, move on, or I can give some feedback back. But especially when it's identity based, it's not your job to educate somebody else. If you want to, great, do it, engage in that conversation. You're not required to. I think that makes sense, right, Amanda?
Yes. Oh my gosh, like 100%. So that resonates with me so much, because I often get that too. Like saying sorry so much, saying thank you so much. That's me. I like to acknowledge what, my actions, what I'm doing, or if someone has done something for me, right? And so I love that. I haven't often thought about it in that way, Rebecca, but you're right. That is something too that we can reject as well too, right? Of, you know what? This is just part of this is part of me and I don't have to change that. So yeah, that's spot on. Definitely, I think encouraging that dialogue, asking those questions, and even being willing to give that other person feedback as well too is spot on. So okay, we're gonna show the next one is just giving you an example. This is just another model that we found about how to think about that process of feedback. And so this is a feedback decision tree from Harvard Business Review, where again, it's really getting you to start with that first question of trust. I really liked that this model named trust. Do I trust the motives of the person who delivered the feedback? Right. And then again, kind of going with what we've been talking through of like, is it a yes? Is it a no? And then asking, how does this feedback align with my values, with my goals? Right. And then again, deciding where to go from that. It has the checking in with the trusted mentors, and figuring out, hey, is this right? How should I be thinking about this and interpreting this? So this is just another model to give you an example. And then we also want to share some language with you about how to perhaps think about fostering your growth mindset, right? Because again, we want feedback to be seen as a tool to help you grow. And so here's some language that you can think about seeing, does it fit the situation? How does it fit, right? And so this is one example of, I'm committed to growth and consistent improvement. And maybe this feedback will provide me with some important information for my development, right? We have a couple others listed that, feedback is providing me with an opportunity to grow. Maybe I'm receiving this feedback because they want me to improve and be a part of the team. And I think there's one more. If I want to improve, feedback provides external perspectives I can leverage. So, all these reframes may or may not suit your situation. Just like clothes, you can try it on, see how does this feel. Does this feel like it fits? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, maybe it raises questions about the feedback, that again takes you back to asking some clarifying questions of the giver, of the person who gave you this feedback, right? Maybe you see this one around, oh, I'm receiving this feedback because they want me to improve and be a part of the team. But the feeling of it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like they want you to improve. And maybe it doesn't feel like they want you to be part of the team. Maybe it feels like there's something else going on. That's something to then assess, check in with your trusted crew, to get their thoughts on it as well too. But we want to encourage folks to think about finding language that feels right to you to help you change your perspective in those moments, right? So that we can move from the emotions behind it and move further into the I'm curious and I want to construct some new meaning out of this. All right, so our example scenario. So let's say that you have a goal to prepare to move into a management and leadership position. And so let's say that you decide to share this goal with your supervisor, and they say, okay, can I offer you some feedback? And then the feedback is, well, I think you need to speak up more during meetings. So there's many ways to interpret this, right? So we got to move to the reflection stage to really figure out, where is this coming from? What situations is my supervisor maybe referring to? Are there specific contexts that they can, offer of, is this in, group meetings with our team? Is this in meeting with executive leadership? Is this in meetings with, there's over 100 staff who are in that meeting? So really getting some more information about what's that context? Where is this coming from? Recognizing that, maybe they're giving this feedback after you shared your goal. And so maybe there is an element of, hey, I want to support your growth. And this is just from my perspective, how you can better prepare yourself to move into that leadership position. But you also should ask yourself, is this something I want to do? Does that resonate with how I want to be a leader? So really reflecting and asking yourself, okay, if my goal is to move into this leadership position, asking yourself, what kind of leader do you want to be, right? Moving into a leadership or management position can look like different things for different folks, right? So really identifying what that actually looks like for you. Um, and then of course we know there might be emotions that can come up, right? Maybe you've had past experiences of not being able to speak up for various reasons. Maybe for some of us, we may see ourselves as more introverted. I know I definitely identify in that way. And so maybe we've had some negative experiences of speaking up and then not being received. Um, Maybe we come from a culture that discourages speaking up. And maybe we also have experiences of it being connected to our gender as well too, right? So all of this is important to recognize and understand, where is the feeling also coming from for you of what that feedback might be triggering. Again, getting into the constructing new meaning, right? Reframing to start to contextualize that feedback. So, let's say, okay, maybe I do want to try to speak up more in certain meetings. I'm going to think about how does that connect to my goal? Well, maybe I do want to be in a leadership position where I do need to set some direction for folks, right? And delegate and offer my opinion. So I'm going to maybe start to try that out in small ways to figure out, does this fit? Is this actually what I want? Maybe this is a way to explore. Do I really want to move into a leadership position in this way? Um, and then, this connects then to the responding and acting part where, check in with others and ask others, hey, this is my goal. How do you think I can work towards accomplishing this goal? Right. So almost reframing that conversation around, this is the goal that I want to achieve. What do I need to do to get there? And you can collect all these different external perspectives and then decide, how do you want to respond, and build an action plan. So these are just some ideas to help you think about how to put this into context. Rebecca, anything to add more on here on what else folks could do in this situation?
I love the framework and it worked really well in this situation. A lot of the things you were mentioning kind of went back to those lenses that we talked about in the beginning and kind of seeing where the feedback is coming from. And I really liked how you mentioned that you get to decide if this is the way you want to move forward, if this is the kind of leader you want to be. You could also, when you're thinking about responding and acting, think about ways maybe you want to set direction and you want to speak up at more in meetings, but is there some structure or a framework you can use to make it comfortable for you, to make it fit within your cultural values or your practice or your personality, whatever it is? Maybe it's restructuring a meeting and making it easier for everyone to speak up. Maybe it's adding things to the chat. We look at leadership a lot of this is a good example because we often look at leadership as one way. There's like this typical version of a leader, but it doesn't have to be one way. There's many different kinds of leaders, and actually we're much stronger if we have these different kinds of leaders. So it's really an active leadership to think about how you can move forward in a way that resonates with you. You're paving a path forward for other people too.
Definitely, definitely. I love that. Because again, we want to emphasize that there are different ways that folks step into leadership roles. Something else that came to mind, Rebecca, when you were talking about that is that um, you know, leadership can also look like, and often does look like, listening, right? Being someone who listens, who observes. And so, it made me think with this example, that could be a response, right? Of actually, the reason I'm not speaking up is because I'm trying to hear what others are saying to then kind of decide collectively, what is this group telling us about what we want and need to do to move forward, right? So again, I love that you know we're thinking about how um how engaging, sorry, there's a lot bit of noise, but how you can take the feedback and think about it in a lot of different contexts relevant to, your goal of, I want to be a leader, here's how I want to lead. And it may look different from how my supervisor sees leadership.
Yeah. And it can be problem. Then if you bring up just like you said, that conversation about I'm listening and this is an important quality, then you can get into problem solving. So how can we make that more visible? Like how can we center that way of leadership and problem solve together? And maybe there's a slight tweak you can make so it shows that you're really actively listening, but instead of it being directional, like, are you going to do this or not?
Exactly. And the directional is what we want to move away from that.
Yes. So sometimes you want to get feedback on something. Maybe it's nothing in particular, but you want to kind of see like what other perspectives are there. So when you're soliciting feedback, a lot of the same things come into play. You want to really identify your goals. Um, if feedback is about empowering and growth, what are your goals in that space? Is there an impact that you want to check? Is there an area you want to go? Be really curious about these areas of both strength and growth. How can you leverage those strengths? What growth areas do you have? Maybe those growth areas are ways that you can partner with other people. Try to be really specific about what you want feedback on. The more specific you are, the easier it is for somebody to give you feedback. Because as we kind of talked about in the beginning, feedback can feel a little bit loaded sometimes. Not everyone is comfortable giving constructive feedback. They may not look at it as this growth. They might have baggage around it. So if you're really specific, it helps narrow things down and kind of focus in on a problem area or a growth space so you can solve together. Of course, consider who you want feedback from, whose perspective is missing. And this can mean a lot of things. It can mean a perspective, maybe there's a senior perspective, maybe there's a customer perspective, a peer perspective. Maybe there's a perspective of an identity that's different than yours, that you kind of want to check in on. These are all good areas that you can kind of grow and just grow your frame and your view. One of the things I really like is this magic question of asking for just one thing. Because feedback, it's a lot. What do you focus in on? But if you ask somebody, what's one thing you see me doing that gets in my way? What's one thing I could change that would make a difference to you? These questions kind of unlock and let somebody make this feedback really boxed in, like really small. Bite-sized, that's the word I'm looking for, bite-sized. So they can give you one thing, and then you can kind of have a dialogue on that. One thing often leads to other things in a good way. It makes things comfortable. It kind of sets the foundation for this conversation. And then from there, you can kind of start building this feedback culture that you have. So these are great questions to ask to kind of start that feedback conversation. What do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like this, asking for just one thing, because the more people that you ask, you're going to start to collect a lot of different, ideas and thoughts, right? That you can then get to decide, okay, here's how I want to put this all together. Maybe you see that there are certain themes that you want to pay more attention to, right? And another thing I like about this is, what Rebecca, with what you were saying too, is that it just helps give some focus, right? And some clarity on the giver's side of, okay, just one thing, right? To focus on that can be actionable, right? And actually helpful to support that person's growth. Yeah.
Yep. And you can still go through all of those steps that we gave in receiving feedback. So keep that in mind. You still get to decide, even if you're soliciting it, you get to decide what to do with it. You can decide what meaning you construct, all of those things.
Definitely.
So this really leads to the cultivating a healthy feed forward culture.
So we identified a couple of elements around what does this look like to get us to think about how do we cultivate this kind of culture, right? Of feeding forward. It just sounds very nurturing, right? So we noted that psychological safety is critical. If psychological safety does not exist, at that team level, organizational level, even also in the one-on-ones, then it's going to be really hard to make some movement, right? If folks don't feel like they can speak up, if folks don't feel like they can be themselves and be honest. So that's something that has to really be addressed first and foremost, is creating a psychologically safe environment. Um, Connects to also leading with empathy. So going back to one of our key elements of the giving feedback is how are we creating an empathic culture in the organization and in the team as well too, where folks are being receptive to listening, as well as being just open to receiving in a kind and thoughtful way. We want to think about how is this supporting learning and growth. So that's again where it needs to be. That's the direction we want to use feedback as is. I want to give feedback to this individual because I want to support them in their learning and growth based on things that they've already shared with me, right? And then recognizing that again there are going to be different cultural standpoints, different viewpoints that might come out when you start to engage in that feedback conversation. And another last element is that people should feel encouraged to give each other feedback across those hierarchical lines, right? So that folks should be able to feel like they can give feedback to their supervisor without, any form of like retaliation, right? They should feel comfortable being able to give feedback to their peers. And similarly for supervisors and managers to be able to give feedback to their staff as well too, which we know is naturally part of the organization. But again, that feedback channel and loop, it's happening in every different direction, even from folks who are maybe seeking to give feedback to their executive leadership, right? That is also a directional line that we want to encourage and facilitate. And so all of this we really think is what will help us move towards a direction of feedback as empowerment, and it can help us reclaim the actual healthy part about what feedback can and should be. Again, we want to encourage everyone to see feedback as a dialogue and not as a directive, because the more we can start to foster and facilitate these conversations, these discussions, being okay with the fact that it is going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect, right? Everything that Rebecca and I shared with you today, we want this to be a space to encourage you to just start to think about, how can I engage in feedback differently? How can I think about feedback differently? So that it's not just a one-time thing that happens of, okay, I'm giving feedback, maybe once a year or, every quarter, but actually how is it just a part of the culture to encourage us all to think about how supporting each other's growth and the growth of our organization, right? And so this is these are our takeaways for you. Rebecca, how about for you? More other takeaways for folks?
Yeah, we are all going to get feedback as a directive at some point. And we invite you to flip that if you want and create a dialogue and really make it a conversation about learning. Kind of unpack those labels that might exist and enter into a space of problem solving and really trying to understand the other perspective, whether you're giving or receiving. Getting really curious without judgment. At the end of it all, we just really invite you to reclaim and reframe feedback so that it works for you. You can take it as a gift. You can leave the gift on the curb. Feedback should be something that's connected to empowerment and growth. And so we want you to make it work for you in those ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, we hope that you've gotten a lot from this presentation. And thank you again to the Now team for inviting us to present on this topic. And we'll pass it back to Deepak.
Thank you very much, Amanda and Rebecca, for your inspiring presentation. That was great. And we really appreciate you for sharing your insights and experiences with this committee today and all the attendees that are watching this for the Now conference. Thank you very much.